Hello, my name's Sarah Aylward. I'm a lecturer in the School of Law at the University of Wollongong, and I'm delighted to be able to share my research on women's legal memoirs and the 18th century origins of the Me Too moment. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge that I'm recording this presentation and I will be joining the David Nicol Smith conference from Darawal land, which is the northern part of Illawarra near Wollongong. I pay my respects to the custodians and owners of this land, past, present and emerging. So this presentation is part of my broader research into women's legal memoirs, particularly of their experiences of sexual violence and of their experiences in dealing with the justice system from the 18th century through to the present day. And I'm particularly interested here in the parallels that can be drawn between the 18th century and the Me Too moment in the digital era. So I'll start with just a short overview of how I see the Me Too, how I see defining Me Too. Now, some people will refer to Me Too as a movement, some as a moment. I prefer to think of it as moment because I think it captures the temporality of it as well as its breadth and its general indeterminacy. So much public and private activity that is taking place can be associated with that term. And within political science, the idea of a movement generally requires some form of leadership, some sense of agenda, some kind of goals, and whether something that is really associated with a social media hashtag in terms of Me Too's global reach could really be described as a movement having those goals, I think is a little debatable. The life writing scholar Lee Gilmore has really usefully analysed Me Too as a scene of collective witness in which individual private experience becomes a shared public experience, predominantly by men, but also by women, but also by men. It is a mass witnessing of victim and survivor testimony of sexual violence, and its power arises from the fact that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So Gilmore theorises that the stories that may seem isolated or insignificant on their own gather power through Me Too by becoming part of a collective. Now, the extent to which that can affect long-term or even medium-term change is still a question of debate, and we'll have to see how the Me Too moment unfolds. The Me Too is enabled by social media. It's emerged as a result of new digital technologies and the new forms of subjectivity and agency that they offer. It's also important to recognise that it's been enabled by the lax regulatory approach that has been taken to the internet and to social media platforms generally. And Me Too, among other digitally based political movements or moments, do raise questions or illuminate questions regarding the role of the state in regulating internet corporations and in regulating these kinds of communication channels. And governments in Australia and the world are now trying to figure out how to approach the regulating the internet, and indeed whether it is possible to regulate it within legal systems that are inherently confined by the jurisdictions of nation states. And I also view Me Too as a moment with peculiarly legal resonance, because Me Too both performs and symbolises law's failure. In Australia, the main consequences of Me Too have been an inquiry into sexual harassment in Australian workplaces. Most of the cases have involved defamation rather than sexual harassment or sexual assault. There has been some movement around law reform regarding gag laws and sexual consent laws. But as this collective scene of witness that Gilmore describes, it really does represent the failure of law to provide protection and remedies to victims of sexual violence. So I want to take a little step back a little way now, because often Me Too is, in discussions of Me Too, are associated with values around innovation and novelty. And I think that this emphasis on the newness of the digital can mask really interesting and important continuities with what has gone before. If we backtrack 250 years, there are clear continuities between the emergence of women's public testimony in the 18th century and the Me Too moment in the 21st. So from the mid-18th century, women began to publish personal accounts of their experiences of sexual violence, of the operation of law, and their interactions with the personnel and institutions of law and justice. And they did this through a variety of different forms of life writing. Often these women were motivated to name and shame the male perpetrators of sexual violence, harassment and abuse. And often these men were public figures. So there's a clear parallel here with Me Too in the digital age. What is different about many of the women who are writing in the 18th century was that they often had financial motives. So they were either publishing to try to blackmail their perpetrators into offering them a financial settlement, or they were writing to seek public charity and donations because they were impecunious, so they were in situations where they were in prison for debt. In the same way that Me Too in the 21st century has been enabled by new technologies, these women's published testimony was also enabled by the new technologies associated with print culture in the 18th century, and that also was taking place within a very uncertain, dynamic and shifting regulatory environment. The press had been liberated from the licensing restrictions in the late 17th century. There were new copyright laws that offered protection to authors that were introduced in the early 18th century, and libel laws and civil litigation associated with libel was quite prolific throughout the 18th century. So there was quite a dynamic regulatory environment surrounding the publication of these women's testimony. They also, in the same way that social media does, these new technologies of print held out the promise of greater democratic participation and public accountability. And the women that I'm discussing and referring to in part of this project certainly sought to harness that potential, although they did so within the shadow of defamation law, and many of them record their concerns about libel suits within their memoirs. Now, these testimonies from the 18th century and in the Me Too era essentially respond to law's failure. They are a method of seeking extrajudicial justice where law has failed to provide either protection or a remedy. So if we look about sexual harassment in the 18th century, there really is no legal remedy available. Sexual harassment doesn't become a defined legal concept for another 200 years. And in the case of sexual assault across both the 18th century and the 21st century, legal remedies are extremely difficult to achieve. And so the complainants essentially look to other methods to try to give some structure to their experience and to seek justice. What's different between these two periods, though, is in the way that complainants formulate their expectations of law. So in the 18th century, most of the women are writing directly in response to experience with the legal system. And the failure of law there is explicit in their memoirs. Often the court proceedings or the imprisonment that they've experienced actually ignites their publication of the life writing, and they specifically interrogate what is going on with the operation of law and with the personnel and the institutions of justice. In the 21st century, by contrast, the failure of law tends to be implicit. So few Me Too complainants actually specifically cite the failure of law because essentially they don't regard the law as being in place to serve them. They don't view using or seeking a legal remedy as a viable option. And I think that speaks to sort of the real darkness of this, that across this passage of time, law still isn't actually responding to protect or provide remedies for victims of sexual violence. So this project emerges from my wider project on women's legal memoirs. And this project started by looking at some of the more better known memoirists from the 18th century who are listed on the left-hand side of the screen here. Many of us will be familiar with some of these women. There has been quite a lot of scholarly attention dedicated to some of their memoirs. Their memoirs are often viewed through the lens of scandal. They're actually called the scandalous memoirists. And although the legal context behind these memoirs have been acknowledged, some of law is still largely seen as peripheral, as part of a context, but no more important than other available lenses through which we could interpret these texts. And what I'm seeking to do is actually to place law at the centre of this inquiry and to show that many of these women are actually much more invested in their engagement with legal subjectivity and with their experiences of law than they are with their experiences of scandal. And once we place law at the centre of this inquiry, it opened up a whole realm of other memoirs that have not received scholarly attention because they haven't fit within this sense of scandal as being the way that the genre is framed. So on the right, there are other memoirs here that were written from very early, quite in the mid-century, right through to the early 19th century. And these women actually are much more explicit in their dealings with law and aren't really so interested in the sort of scandalous approach at all. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus particularly on one memoir by a woman called Anne Bailey, who was also known as Anne Eastick, who published the memoirs of Mrs. Anne Bailey in 1771. And I've chosen to focus on Anne Bailey because her memoir hasn't really seen the light of day since it was published almost exactly 250 years ago. So I think she's deserving of a little scholarly attention. Her memoir illuminates more than any other I've encountered the extent to which the Me Too moment we are currently experiencing is a modernised iteration of the same basic phenomenon that was at work in the 18th century. And this gives me a sense of hope, but also a sense of despair. And the third reason is that encountering Bailey's memoir really does reveal in new ways the central place of law in framing this particular thread of 18th century women's published life writing. There are threads of the continuity that can be drawn to her predecessors and her inheritors of the genre. And this points to the possibility of actually identifying the legal memoir as a subgenre of 18th century women's life writing. So publishing the memoirs, the circumstances surrounding the publication are vague. Bailey was a middle-class woman and a single mother who had fallen on very hard times and lived on the social fringe. So after the death of her husband, she was imprisoned in the King's Bench for sexually transmitted debt, and she formed a series of relationships with politically powerful men. She published the memoir shortly after her release from one period of imprisonment. The title page indicates that it was taken from her own mouth and revised and corrected by herself, and I have not been able to work out who was her collaborator. Another historian of one of the perpetrators that she names has suggested that it may have been John Wilkes, who was her perpetrator's political opponent. The title page also indicates that it was printed for the author, so there's no guidance around the printer or the bookseller. There are also no printed versements, and I haven't been able to trace any kinds of public response to the memoirs so far. It occurred to me that perhaps the people who she named and shamed had purchased the entire print run, which was something that happened with Melinda Graham's memoir in 1750. But the fact that this title page is inscribed with Redmond Simpson's name and there are annotations of different names and different facts throughout this copy that I've got from Echo suggests that it was in circulation and it was being read. Another point relates to the question of authenticity. Bailey was essentially trapped in a cycle of debt, prostitution, persecution, prosecution, and imprisonment, from which she found it more or less impossible to escape. And she was imprisoned at different times in the Poultry Compter, the Covent Garden Roundhouse, the King's Bench, the Marshalsea and the Borough prisons. She appeared in magistrates' courts at Bow Street, Middlesex and Hicks Hall, as well as the Quarter Sessions at Lambeth. And she was confined to Totterhills and Clerkenwell Bridewell. And so this meant that she left rather an extensive legal archive in her wake. And this is just some examples of where I've managed to trace her within the legal archive, and I can confirm that most of what she said is verifiable against the existing records, although I think sometimes she makes herself out to be a little bit more innocent than perhaps she really was. So some remarks on subjectivity in Bailey's memoirs. So what I'm interested in looking at this project and within this memoir is how textual and legal subjectivities sit alongside each other within these memoirs and within what these women are trying to achieve. So Bailey begins with her discussion of the victim, her sort of placing herself within the established generic subjectivity of the victim survivor activist. So she says she's reluctantly compelled to authorship, but that she feels compelled to name and shame her perpetrators and that the public have a right to know this. So this is very similar to the motivations that drive a lot of Me Too testimony in the 21st century, this sense that I need to speak up because other people, this could happen to other people. I want other people to learn about this person, or in the case of the 18th century in particular, I want other people to learn from my mistakes. But sitting with that is her projection of the text into a very juridical framework. So she makes a very strong claim to authenticity here, and she basically presents her text as evidence, which should be evaluated by the candour and good nature of the impartial public. And that very strongly echoes the way that sort of textual and legal subjectivity sat alongside each other in earlier memoirs, particularly Teresa Phillips' Apology. Now, now Bailey's writing a memoir. Other forms of life writing, they are flexible genre that can incorporate a lot of paratext, a lot of paratextual strategies, and Bailey and others certainly draw on those to really carve out their text as a legal argument and to present evidence to try to prove their case and to prove that what they're saying is true and what happened in court or what has happened in terms of their imprisonment is incorrect. Bailey also was driven by a financial motive. She had attempted to blackmail the perpetrator she was naming unsuccessfully, and at the conclusion of her memoir, she appeals to the public for financial assistance and support. So just some more on how I'm looking at textual and legal subjectivity here. So I'm thinking about through subjectivity as constructed relationally through discursive practices, and the discursive practices here I'm interested in are textual and legal. So looking at these authors' self-construction through their texts, how they enter into authorship itself within the legal and print culture kind of framework that they're working in, what expectations have been set in terms of genre and what they contribute in terms of genre, and also looking at their paratextual strategies. And in terms of legal subjectivity, I'm not only interested in legal personhood, that kind of very specific legal concept, but I'm actually interested in looking at how law more broadly contributes to the construction of subjectivity through legal processes or through legal institutions and their claims to kind of neutrality and objectivity. So Bailey, in performing the textual subjectivity of the innocent victim or survivor that had been established within the genre, she does that on one level within the text, but that fundamentally conflicts with the legal subjectivity that she's also bringing to bear, because her commitment to authenticity and her engagement with legal subjectivity really jars with her claim to innocence and naivety. Bailey is not a good female victim. She is resistant to dominant discursive practices concerning gender. So she demonstrates quite a sophisticated knowledge of the legal system. She is able to manipulate it. She understands what her rights are. She actually uses the law to, in terms of prosecuting people who wrong her. So there is this sort of disjunction here between her self-construction on one level of the text and then what she's actually trying to use the text to do to resist her legal subject, the way that her subjectivity is being framed within the law. And this kind of reflects what sort of Costas Dzinas's theory of the modern legal subject, in the split between the idea of subjectum being one who holds legal rights and bears legal responsibilities, and the idea of subjectus, one who is subject to the law through its inherent violence. So Bailey is addressing her position as subjectus on one hand and presenting herself as an innocent victim, not only of the perpetrators of violence, but also of the legal system itself. But her textual subjectivity, her self-construction within text, the fact that she enters into authorship itself, and the way that she constructs herself as using the law, looks towards a trajectory towards subjectum. So there is this sort of split between, in her sort of subjectivity, which she reveals in the publication of the memoir. Okay, so I'll finish up there just by saying I think there's a lot more to be done in terms of looking at women's legal memoirs from the 18th century, not just through the lens of sexual violence and the origins of the Me Too movement, but just to give a much broader sense of why women were publishing life writing at the time, what was driving them to do it, and by looking at how legal and textual subjectivities are in interplay in these texts, it can present sort of new insights into the way that textual subjectivity operates in not only this, but in other genres as well. And I will look forward to discussing more as part of the conference.